All right, ladies and gentlemen, my apologies. I switched on a video preview view there, but apparently it is not coming through right away. So we'll try that again. My apologies for the delayed start, but you are watching Primetime Live. I'm James Cousineau coming to you from Jess FM and Jess TV. Welcome back. Don't forget that, of course, our phone lines are open. You can call in at any point throughout the show to share your opinions on stories or talk about grandma's chocolate chip cookies, whatever you would like. Call in at 1-368-997-6741 at any point throughout the show. You're more than welcome to call in and talk about topics we are covering on the program, or as I said, anything else that comes to mind. The show is all about interacting with you, our favorite viewer. Well, I guess you're all our favorites. We can't pick just one. But in any event, folks, we are going to cover the local news here in Lethbridge with a few top stories that are of importance to you as well. We're going to discuss the current situation in Ukraine. Yes, we need to know, is Donald Trump actually working towards a peace deal, or is he just being fooled by Vladimir Putin in order to buy more time to stock up on ammunitions and artilleries? We'll talk about that. And following that, we'll also have a deep discussion about the increased attacks on journalists around the world. And we're not just talking verbal assaults or physical assaults, we're talking about drone attacks and other murders of journalists around the world. So far, 217 in the dispute, or what I call a war. Donald Trump and others might call it a dispute, but I call it outright war on the Palestine region. So once again, 217 journalists killed in that region alone. So we'll take a look at that after the news, of course. And as we do so, we will jump right in and we will bring the video clips that I've got to share with you a bit later in the program. At this point, we'll move on. So, locally, a new initiative by the Lethbridge Police aims to foster positive connections with the city's youth. They have details coming out now on what they're calling Operation Freeze. Now, nationally, Prime Minister Mark Carney continues his tour of Eastern Europe with discussions of potential Canadian troop deployments to Ukraine if there is a ceasefire. And globally, of course, the tensions are rising between the United States and Prime Minister Modi of India as new tariffs have taken effect. But first, let's take a heartbreaking update on the tragic school shooting in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The community of Minneapolis is in mourning following a senseless act of violence at the Annunciation Catholic Church. This was a Catholic church and school. What was meant to be a joyous start to the school year instead turned into a scene of horror when a gunman opened fire during opening mass. During the morning mass, there were others in the building as well. This took the lives of two children aged just 8 and 10 years old. They were tragically killed while 18 others were wounded. 15 of them were children. The shooter was identified as a 23-year-old Robin Westman, who also took his life at that time in the school or in the church. He was a former student at the Annunciation School, and authorities report that Westman, armed with a rifle, shotgun, and pistol, fired through the church windows from outside before taking his own life in the school's parking lot. Now, reports are coming out that he was a mentally ill, transgender individual going from male to female, but at the end of the day, I don't think that the transgender role really plays any impact on the act of violence. It may have contributed to his confusion and mental health state, though, and that is a concern when you look at the polarization of mental health of people with different genders, different lifestyles, different religions. All of these things are playing into a really divided America. Now, when we look south of our border, we see a lot of that information that actually seeps through into the Canadian media coverage and unfortunately creates an unfair bias as well as to the situation in Canada. This paints a picture to many people of, again, perpetrating even more anger, hate, and violence towards others. On the internet, we need to be very careful about the sources in which we are gaining our information, as there are a lot of bots out there and a lot of basically sweatshops of the technology age. And those are different countries and foreign actors who would like to have you think that they are US citizens or Canadian citizens putting out dissent or other educated comments when in fact it's actually people who are acting out to try and instill more hatred and fear within our communities to make our country weaker. And this is something that is much overlooked in the world of the internet and on social media. Now, as we return to that story, the FBI is investigating the horrific act as an act of domestic terrorism and potential hate crime targeting Catholics. A former classmate described Westman as a quiet individual who harbored dislike for the school and had previously avoided attending Mass. Now, in a tragic twist, Westman's mother is also a former employee of the church. She had retired after several years of working there. Now, of course, our hearts go out to the victims and their families of this incredibly tragic event in this difficult time. And we'll continue to keep you updated next week as more details come out throughout the week, as I'm sure they will. Now, for a look at what's happening closer to home in Lethbridge. The Lethbridge Police Service is taking a sweet approach to community policing. In a new partnership with the Circle K convenience stores, they've launched Operation Freeze. This initiative will see police officers handing out coupons for free Frosters. Yes, the Circle K version of the Slurpee. And they're going to hand those out when they observe young people caught in the act of good behavior. So it's not interacting with them to penalize them or punish them for misdeeds, but instead reward them for being good citizens and for helping others or just being of good behavior. So again, a great incentivization for youth and children to be good, to behave well, to respect others, to help others, and of course, a very positive interaction with the police, which I think goes a long way to building that trust. Now, in infrastructure news, the Whoop Up Bridge again in the news, but this time they are talking about the bridge rehabilitation project instead of the cause or the information about the truck impact. So let's look at the project in itself. It is moving into its next phase, so that is good news, of course. For those trying to beat the heat, some good news. The city is extending the outdoor splashing season. So that means that with the extended summer expected to last well into September, you will be able to partake in a bit of splashing around at the local pools. Now, on the roads, expect some delays at the intersection of Mayor McGrath Drive and 14th Avenue South as crews work to replace traffic signal boxes. Always a fun thing to deal with when you have traffic interruptions, but one of those necessary evils to try and get it done before the winter weather hits. Now, in a proactive move, the city of Lethbridge has acquired a new wildland sprinkler trailer to bolster its firefighting capabilities. So, big news for firefighting capabilities and for emergency response. For those passionate about public transit, the city is also currently seeking applications for the Transit Advisory Committee. So if you have input and would like to speak on behalf of others when it comes to the transit plans and the transit advisory, then you can reach out to the city and find out about applying to that position as well. Now, let's take a look at one of our sponsors as we're talking about transportation. Are you planning a move? Whether you're locating across town or across Western Canada, our sponsor, Carey Movers Limited, is here to help. Serving Metro Vancouver and the Fraser Valley for local moves, as well as all of Western Canada for your long distance needs, Carey Movers offers a full range of services for both residential and commercial clients. They can even move specialty items like hot tubs, pianos, classic cars, and statues and monuments. For a stress-free move, visit careymovers.com, and that is www.karymovers.com for a free quote. And once again, thanks to Carey Movers for sponsoring this episode yet once again. Now, let's go back to our top stories here, and we're going to take a look at stories from across the nation. The National Report with Prime Minister Mark Carney in the midst of a significant trip through Eastern Europe, with recent stops in Ukraine, Poland, Germany, and Latvia. High on his agenda, of course, are discussions about the possibility of sending Canadian troops to Ukraine should a ceasefire be reached. Back in Ottawa, the federal government made a series of announcements today. A preliminary report on the Future of Sport in Canada Commission has been released, and the government has issued a statement acknowledging International Overdose Awareness Day. So, some big things happening in Ottawa that they are addressing. Now, new sanctions have also been imposed on individuals and entities in Moldova. Now, in industry news, a Made in Canada Ferries and Rail Summit has been announced aimed at boosting these key sectors for the Canadian economy. We know that BC Ferries was having some conversations back and forth with Ottawa and other premiers, as a lot of the new ferries that are being built are actually being built in China instead of being built here in British Columbia or in Canada using Canadian steel products. Now, for film buffs, the National Film Board's Hot House program for emerging animators has just launched its 15th edition online. 15 years already. It's amazing. But they showcase a fresh talent from across the country, so check it out. You can also find the National Film Board online where you can stream a lot of different programs that maybe you've never seen or heard of before. A lot of independent films that showcase Canadian talent, Canadian content, and of course, Canadian creators. So, in other national headlines, a wildfire in Nova Scotia has tragically destroyed 20 homes. In better news, meanwhile, for shoppers, a new Zellers location is set to open in Edmonton, of all places. Edmonton is getting a Zellers store back. That's exciting. I remember, what was his name there? Zeddy or Teddy or whatever, and the lowest prices were the law. And controversial bill is tabled in Quebec that would ban prayer in public spaces. Personally, I think that that is an overreach. I see why someone of any faith should be banned from making prayer in a public park or anywhere else. So once again, uh, in Quebec, of course, another controversial move, but we'll see how that goes. As I said, the controversial bill is tabled, but it has not been passed yet. And again, that is banning prayer in public spaces. And finally, a landmark tobacco settlement will see billions of dollars flowing to the provinces as the settlement comes in to compensate for additional health and other related expenses, including tobacco use cessation programs that were sponsored by the health ministry in various provinces throughout the country. Once again, some compensation is on its way back to the provinces in terms of that tobacco settlement. All right, thinking about that upcoming move, once again, we are acknowledging our episode sponsor. Don't let the stress get to you. Our sponsor, Carry Movers Limited, is a full service moving company that can handle everything from packing and unpacking to the heavy lifting. They serve the Metro Vancouver and Fraser Valley areas for local moves, and of course, all of Western Canada for long distance relocations for businesses, residences, and specialty items. Now, of course, you can get your free no obligation quote online at www.carrymovers.com. Let Carry Movers make your next move your best move. Now, we will look at the top headlines from around the world. A trade dispute brewing between the United States and India as a 50% tariff rate has come in on Indian goods, and that officially took effect over this past week. The relationship between the two economic giants is described as complicated, which I think anything dealing with Donald Trump and his administration could be described as complicated, so it's not surprising. The international community is condemning a recent series of Russian strikes on Ukraine that have left at least 15 people dead. Both the UN Secretary General and European leaders have voiced their outrage. This again is a major concern as winter is slowly creeping up on us. especially in Ukraine, where it appears that the Russian the Russian military is targeting energy infrastructure within Ukraine before winter hits. But we'll get more into that on our report on Ukraine in just a few minutes. In the Middle East, Israel has conducted a second strike in a week on Yemen's capital, Sana'a. Yeah, it seems like Israel is just lashing out at countries all over the place in the Middle East, and it seems far from a stable region, regardless as to Donald Trump's involvement to deal with the Israel strikes and participating in strikes on Iran. It appears that Netanyahu just continues to attack other nations, and really there isn't a whole lot of address coming from the U.S. on these attacks. In political news, though, speaking of Donald Trump, he is scheduled to address the United Nations General Assembly on September the 23rd. And European nations are taking a firm stance on Iran's nuclear program, initiating a snapback of sanctions at the United Nations. And we anticipate that Donald Trump will have something to say about that again on September the 23rd when he is addressing the nation. And in Japan, the city of Tokyo is preparing for a potential eruption of the iconic Mount Fuji, even releasing an AI simulated video to educate the public on the possible impact. Again, just do a Google search for that and you can find the AI simulation that's been put out by the city of Tokyo and the government of Japan there. And finally, the United Kingdom is set to summon the Russian ambassador after a British council building was damaged during recent strikes on Kiev. Now, what is exactly going to be said, or what the responsibility or reparations will be, we'll have to wait and find out. It's not the only diplomat being addressed, though, apparently. Over in Denmark, they have summoned the ambassador from the United States to talk about several individuals linked to Donald Trump who are actively involved in a campaign of sorts in Greenland, trying to convince people to flip over to supporting the Donald Trump and U.S. taking over Greenland. This, of course, is a very serious act of foreign interference and interfering with the sovereignty of a nation. So again, the U.S. ambassador has been summoned to the parliament there, or their whatever their equivalent of a parliament would be. That's it for our local and national news stories, as well as our stories from around the globe. And following now, we are going to move over to the situation in Ukraine as well. After that, we'll take a look in depth at the increased violence against journalists around the globe. Let's first, though, take a look, ladies and gentlemen, at a few video clips from Ukraine. Yes, these are a bit older video clips, and the reason why these are being shown is for the fact that they are still very relevant today. So we will start and clear that. Let's see if we are. I've got Jesse in the technical room there, so I just need to check with Jesse. Are you able to see any video streaming on the screen besides myself, Jesse? And once again, Jesse, if you're there, if you can just let me know if you are seeing a video image on screen, that would be great. No, you can't. Okay, so sometimes with this rendezvous software, folks, we don't get the images up to share that we would like. So we'll just pass by those and we will look at resolving that issue in the future. And we will go from there. So let's see. We might be able to bring them up on the back screen. I just have to see if I have them linked here because they are on two separate systems. So let's just take a look here. No, we don't have them linked to that screen because I wasn't expecting that. I thought we had that fixed. But my apologies, folks. Don't worry. We'll just move on with the show. Not a problem. And then we'll possibly get them in at the end of the show. Now, the war of attrition. A current update when we talk about the war in Ukraine, it's grinding into its fourth year. The battlefield has settled into a brutal rhythm of attrition. This is marked by incremental Russian gains and immense human and infrastructural cost. While Ukraine defenses show no sign of looming collapse, they are under severe and constant strain from Russia's numerically superior army. Now, the front line, a 1,000-kilometer scar across eastern and southern Ukraine, remains a landscape of trench warfare where progress is measured in meters and not kilometers. Russian forces employing novel infiltration tactics with small, agile infantry groups have managed to penetrate Ukrainian lines and establish a presence in an eighth region. This is I'm not even going to bother trying to announce that, but they have claimed another region and bypassing more heavily fortified positions. Recent Russian advances have been confirmed near Sumy, Borova, Toretsk, and Petrovsk. Now, while Ukrainian forces have mounted limited but successful counteroffensives near Sumy and Borova, highlighting the fluid yet grinding nature of the ground war as they push and push back, or get pushed and then push back. Now, this ground stalemate is contrasted by a dramatic escalation in Russia's aerial campaign. No longer confined, of course, to the Eastern Front, Russian missile and drone attacks are regularly targeting central and western Ukraine. This is aiming to terrorize the civilian population and disrupt critical logistical hubs. A recent massive assault on Kiev involved the launch of nearly 600 strike drones and 31 missiles, one of the largest barrages of the war. The attack overwhelmed air defenses, striking at least 33 locations across the capital, including residential buildings again. A shopping mall was also hit, and significantly diplomatic and cultural missions representing the European Union and the UK, as we touched on earlier. Now, the strikes, which caused dozens of casualties, signaled a new level of ruthlessness and a willingness to direct target symbols of Western support. In a separate, rare attack on Western Ukraine, Russian missile strikes went and made contact with an American-owned electronics factory. Moscow claimed the facility was part of Ukraine's military-industrial complex. And in the meantime, Kiev is vehemently denying that this U.S.-owned electronics factory has anything to do with their military complex. So we'll watch and see if the U.S. actually has the balls to stand up to Putin and say anything, but I'm thinking that Trump will just kind of shrug it off. Now, the timing and targets of these attacks suggest they are not random acts, not random acts of terror, but calculated political signals. The assault on Kiev, for example, occurred after a U.S.-led diplomatic summit leading Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky to declare that Russia chooses ballistics instead of getting its ass to the negotiating table. And I might have been paraphrasing there. But they're striking the EU mission and the British Council. Russia is engaging in a form of violent diplomacy. They are demonstrating contempt for the Western-led peace process and communicating to Washington, Brussels, and London that it retains the power to escalate at will. This in the face, of course, of recent talks between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin that seem to have fallen flat. Facing Russia's overwhelming firepower, Ukraine has refined its asymmetric response, waging a strategic economic war deep inside Russian territory. They're utilizing a growing arsenal of domestically produced long-range drones. Ukrainian forces are also systematically targeting the infrastructure that fuels Russia's war machine. These strikes have successfully disrupted between 13 and 20% of Russia's oil refining capacity, causing significant gasoline shortages and price spikes, as well as growing discontent among the Russian populace. Now, this strategically imposes direct and tangible costs on the Russian state, threatening its macroeconomic stability, as well as propaganda cannot be reaching uh, its full target or easily be obscured. Now, the conflict has thus evolved into a dual front war, a physical front of attrition in the east and a strategic front targeting the economic and logistical resilience of each nation. Now, let's talk about the human cost of this intensified conflict, and that in itself is staggering. The first 5 months of 2025 saw a nearly 50% surge in civilian casualties compared to the same period in 2024. July 2025 setting a new monthly record for civilian deaths and injuries since the war's opening months. The constant bombardment has triggered fresh waves of displacement from the frontline regions, adding to the 3.8 million people already internally displaced across the country. The humanitarian crisis is deepening daily, with access to healthcare, education, and food severely compromised. This is especially true for communities within 30 kilometers of the front line. The war has led to a quadrupling of the national poverty rate, creating a desperate situation that sets the stage for a political and potential humanitarian catastrophe in the coming winter should essential services collapse under the sustained attack. Now, in terms of the diplomatic facade that I touched on, peace talks, are they really happening or are they just another tool of war that is being implemented by Vladimir Putin? Now, parallel to the escalating violence on the ground, a US led diplomatic initiative has struggled to gain any traction. It's revealing a stark divergence between the public performance of negotiation and the private pursuit of military objectives. Following a high profile summit between US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska, hopes for a breakthrough were quickly dashed. The process had stalled, with President Trump publicly expressing frustration at Putin's delays in agreeing to direct talks with Vladimir Zelensky. In response, Trump has issued a 2 week ultimatum threatening massive sanctions or massive tariffs if a summit is not scheduled. This is a move that signals a potential escalation in economic pressure. However, the White House's reaction to Russia's recent brazen missile attack on Kiev was notably subdued. Press Secretary Carolyn Levitt, or Bargain Basement Barbie as I refer to her, stated that the president was not surprised by the strikes and urged both sides to de escalate, an unequivocal response that suggests a misreading of Moscow's intentions for a lack of effective leverage. Let's just take a look at that now. Donald Trump has always come out when he doesn't have policy or when he wants to just push or kick the can down the road, so they say. He always says in 2 weeks, in 2 weeks, watch what happens in 2 weeks, watch what happens in 2 weeks. I mean, deadlines have come and gone with Putin, and Trump has taken no action. And that led to the US media and others online calling him Taco, and that is Trump always chickens out. Trump really doesn't, I don't believe that he has any type of real policy in place to deal with Russia in a long term strategic planning to stop this war. Instead, he has been relying on what he thought was a friendship with Vladimir Putin and an ability to put pressure through the threat of sanctions, causing Putin to buckle, which has not happened. I think that's actually surprised Trump that all of his threats are not working and that people are seeing through him. Now, expert analysis and the Kremlin's own actions strongly indicate that Russia is not negotiating in good faith, but instead engaged in a deliberate strategy of protraction. Putin has consistently avoided substantive talks while his military continues its slow but steady advance, a tactic that Ukrainian and European officials have repeatedly identified as a stalling maneuver. The diplomatic intransigence is not a public prelude to compromise. It is a second front in the war, and that is very clear. Now, by engaging in the process of diplomacy, Putin buys invaluable time to rearm and prepare for the next phase of the conflict while projecting an image of reasonableness to a global audience and potentially sowing division among Ukraine's allies. Now, his demands remain maximalist and politically impossible for Kiev to accept, including the surrender of heavily fortified, unconquered territory in the Donbass, a concession that would amount to a public suicide or political suicide for any Ukrainian leader because it is against the constitution for them to follow through on that, even if they wanted to, which I doubt very much is the case, because that would mean that they have fought and lost all of those lives in an illegal war waged by Russia, and conceding all of that land would just undo any of the pride that the country holds for themselves and that the world holds for them as well. Now, the so-called peace talks, though, so far are a farce, and we can see that clearly, and they are achieved, or they are achieving at any level. The Ukrainian table could come forward. Sorry, they. Where was I there? Sorry. So yeah, at the negotiating table, it would cost hundreds of thousands of lives to win just the one battle when you look at what it is designed to achieve. And that is, again, the concerns that are going forward. Now, the other concern and the strategy appearing to be successfully exploiting the U.S. administration's transactional approach to diplomacy. Donald Trump's focus on securing a deal frames the conflict as a negotiable dispute between two parties, a framework that is fundamentally mismatched with Putin's far more expansive ideological and strategic goals of reshaping European security and ensuring the permanent subordination of the Ukrainian state. Now, let's not forget that Donald Trump also wants access to the rare earth minerals, and he wants that in exchange for his role in the peace process. Now, again, this should be a non-starter. At absolutely no point should the U.S. be getting any type of concessions out of a peace deal, with the exception of course, anything that the rest of the world achieves when it comes to the loans that were made, not the gifting of certain items when it comes to supporting the war. But there were also some transactional loans that were made to Ukraine, as well as other financial aid and support that was given. So at that level, anything that is brought back and forward should be distributed throughout the countries who have contributed to the war. And it may be that the U.S. gets a part of that, of course. But again, don't be fooled by the rhetoric out of the White House, because they are not providing the lion's share of the financial and equipment contributions to Ukraine. With that said, with Donald Trump's pausing and restarting and pausing again of various supply networks and equipment going to Ukraine, that again buys more time for Vladimir Putin to up his game and to increase their military production. Now, as we look at that, President Trump's focus, as I said, is securing a deal, and that is, really one-sided. He is really bending over and really catering to the whims of Vladimir Putin instead of standing firm for what is right under international law, under international policy, and what's right for the Western world in supporting one of our allies. Now, this asymmetry as excuse me, tickle my throat there, has made the U.S. administration susceptible to manipulation. Again, we've seen this over and over again, and it's not specific to this area. Really, when you look at Trump dealing with anyone and any country around the world, it seems that there is a lot of ability for foreign leaders to manipulate Trump. Just throw some splashy money in his face, gold, shiny objects, or, underage girls, and he'll do whatever you want. Now, this has made the U.S. administration just the laughing joke of the world when it comes to any type of serious considerations that people see with them. And when you look at the alignment, of course, that aligns perfectly with Putin's preference for a comprehensive settlement that can be debated indefinitely. Again, prolonging the war, prolonging and increasing the lives that are being lost on both sides of the battle. Now, the American desire for a quick, visible diplomatic victory has become a vulnerability that Putin is actively leveraging to advance long term military objectives. Once again, as the winter comes, it is a big concern. Now, with the deadlock over post war security guarantees, that remains another sticking point as well. And that is illustrating the, inter- the interlacing of both the Europeans, the Americans, the Canadians, and all of the allies of Ukraine. Now, Canada is exploring the options of sending troops over as a part of a peacekeeping mission should there be a ceasefire. But the US, again, is saying yes, they say no, and it goes back and forth. Now, European leaders are also discussing robust security models, including an Article 5 style mutual defense clause and the potential deployment of European troops after this happens. And again, that will be in line with trying to keep peace in the region once it is hit. Now, the Kremlin has drawn a series of red lines that make any meaningful agreement impossible. Moscow has unequivocally rejected the presence of any NATO country troops on Ukrainian soil and, more critically, insists that Russia itself and even China must be involved as guarantors of Ukraine's security architecture. This demand is a non starter for Kiev and its allies, and it rightfully should be a non starter, as it would grant Moscow permanent veto over Ukraine's sovereignty and security, requiring any guarantee worthless and enshrining Russia's ability to launch future aggression at will. And that's not just against Ukraine, but it would be rewarding them and basically giving them the green light to go after other nations, and that would include several non NATO members in the Baltic region. Now, as I said, the diplomatic stalling is not an end in itself. It's a critical enabler of Russia's next major strategic offense, and we've seen that started up already in a sense that they are starting to hit energy infrastructure, and we think that that is going to be a major thing as we get closer to fall. Now, the time bought through sham negotiations is being used to prepare for that devastating winter campaign, aimed at the systemic collapse of the Ukrainian state through the destruction of critical energy infrastructure. Ukraine's energy grid, battered by years of relentless Russian attacks, is now perilously fragile and represents the nation's most critical vulnerability. Now, intensified Russian bombardments between March and May of last year, destroyed a massive amount of generation capacity. It also has continued throughout this year and again has brought down the capacity mid-year to about 70% of their capacity. So again, bringing down the level of energy that's being produced and supplied, and it also has an impact on their ability to bring in energy from neighboring European states or countries. Now, the pre war power generation capacity in Ukraine was about 55 gigawatts, and the available capacity in mid 2024 post attacks was 18 gigawatts. Now, the projected peak winter demand for this coming season or this coming winter will be an estimated 18.5. So you can see that there is already a drop there. Now, the maximum import capacity from Europe is 1.7 gigawatts. However, the projected supply deficit overall in a best case scenario, if there are no new attacks, which we know are happening as we speak, would be up to 6 gigawatt deficit. So again, that is a best case scenario, but we know that is probably going to be much worse. Now, as of recent, the thermal generation capacity that's been damaged or occupied by Russia is at about 70%, and the large network substations damaged is about half of them throughout Ukraine. While Ukraine's grid has been degraded, Russia's capacity to attack it has been massively enhanced. The Kremlin has fully transitioned to a war economy, which essentially is dedicating immense resources to military production. Let's take a look at that for a minute. And that means that Russian factories are now producing artillery ammunition at a rate estimated to be 7 times that of NATO nations combined. Yes, 7 times. Meanwhile, if you take a look at that, since the full scale invasion, tank production has increased a 5.6 fold, while artillery shell production has surged by an astonishing 17.5 times. Now, crucially, for a winter air campaign as of June 2025, Russia has amassed a strategic stockpile estimated at over 1,950 missiles in the holding or the reserve, as well as these being ballistic and cruise missiles. They also include hypersonic variants. They also have thousands of Shahed type attack drones, and its industrial base can now produce up to 195 new missiles and 170 drones per day. Yes, per day, and that shows you the capacity that they have. Now, let's keep in mind that their long-term struggles with technology modernization is there, but it's able to still mass produce good enough weapon systems. And when we say good enough, it means that they are at least able to attack some areas of Ukraine with even their worst equipment or their worst missiles. And that is still an existential threat to Ukraine, especially when they look at just saturation attacks, so just throwing everything at once. The convergence of these factors, of course, points to a clear and chilling strategic logic that the diplomatic pause of summer and autumn has allowed Russia to build its weapon stockpiles to a level sufficient for, as I said, a saturation attack that can overwhelm Ukraine's depleted air defenses. The bigger concern, of course, is the replenishment of those air defenses and the on again, off again reliability of the U.S. as a supply partner. And of course, when the U.S. is now sending things to Ukraine, they expect the European nations to pick up the tab and pay the Americans for that. So the Americans may say they are contributing, but they are actually selling the goods and the weapons to Ukraine now. They are not just providing them out of the goodness of their heart. Now, let's shift gears a bit as we report on the war in Ukraine. Of course, reporters play a very pivotal role in all world conflicts, in diplomatic processes, in democracies to hold people accountable. But that is becoming even more of a risk as there's a global assault on journalism. It seems to be that the world of journalism is becoming a deadly profession in the escalating war on the press. As I personally have been over to Ukraine and reported from Kiev, from Bucha, from Lviv, and other parts of the country in the front lines there, I know several journalists that I had the pleasure of meeting while I was in the country that have unfortunately not made it back home to their families and never will, unfortunately. So again, thoughts go out to all of those. But this is, while the war is still raging in Ukraine, it's a parallel because the global war is also being waged against the truth tellers themselves. The last several years have been the deadliest for journalism on record, marking a terrifying escalation in lethal violence against the press. In 2024, the Committee to Protect Journalists, also known as the CPJ, documented the killings of at least 124 journalists and media workers worldwide. That has jumped even higher this year in 2025, with 217 alone being killed in Gaza and Palestine at the hands of the Israelis. With that said, that is since the conflict started there with the invasion and the attacks that have been going on. So that is not just this year, that 217 for clarification. However, this does mark the highest annual death toll since the organization began collecting data 3 decades ago. This alarming figure represents a sharp increase from 102 deaths in 2023 and 69 deaths in 2022. This illustrates a clear and dangerous trend. Now, the nature of these killings has also shifted. Increasingly, journalists are not simply tragic collateral damage caught in the crossfire. They are being deliberately targeted by belligerents who view themselves or view the media as strategic threats to be eliminated in order to control the narrative of the conflict. With the ability of these cooker rooms of disinformation that different countries are using now, and the automated AI bots, of course, they are able to push their own narrative much easier on the global scale. Now let's take a look at a little breakdown here in terms of the key conflict zones. And this is when we're looking at conflict zones, but don't forget there are attacks of journalists happening elsewhere, and we'll get into that in just a moment. Now let's take a look here in the global sense in 2024, 124 journalists and media workers were killed. In Gaza in itself, since October 2023, 197 journalists have been killed, and that is mostly at the hands of the Israeli forces. In Ukraine, since February of 2022, over confirmed 18, but suspected several more than that have been killed in Ukraine at the hands of Russian forces. Meanwhile, in Latin America, where they are organized, where they're reporting on organized crime and corrupt government officials, of course, the organized crime and corrupt officials are fighting back and attacking journalists, and that has cost 13 journalists their lives since that time. Now, nowhere is the crisis more acute than in Gaza, as you can tell by those numbers that we just discussed, and that has become the deadliest front for journalists in modern history. As detailed above, as we talked about, since the war began in October 2023, CPJ has confirmed the deaths of at least 197 journalists. And as I said, that is now up to 217 as of today. And that is journalists and media workers. So just for clarification on that, 189 of them being Palestinians killed by Israeli forces. Now, press freedom organizations allege that many of these killings were deliberate. The CPJ has documented at least 24 cases of journalists being intentionally targeted in 2024, with 10 of those incidents occurring in Gaza and Lebanon. A recent Israeli strike on the Nasser hospital compound, for example, killed 5 journalists who were covering the aftermath of the initial attack. The Israeli government has consistently described such incidents as tragic mishaps, or has claimed it was targeting Hamas assets, such as a camera allegedly placed on the hospital roof. Now, these claims are difficult to verify, as Israel has barred international journalists from independently accessing the Gaza Strip for the duration of the war. This policy creates a dangerous information vacuum, and again, it's leaving the world almost entirely reliant on the testimony of local Palestinian reporters, the very group being killed at an unprecedented rate. This situation effectively allows the perpetrator to act to control the narrative about it, making true accountability nearly impossible. This is again where the United Nations and other nations need to step in and insist that there be people being held accountable for such actions, but they're not. Now, the war in Ukraine has also become a battlefield for information where journalists are systematically targeted. Since Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, the Institute of Mass Information has documented over 800 crimes committed by Russia against journalists and media outlets in Ukraine. At least 18 journalists have been killed while on assignment, and that, as I said, I was fortunate enough to know 4 of them who I met while I was covering the war in Ukraine. Now, the evidence in several cases point to deliberate killings by the Russian troops, such as the shooting deaths of American filmmaker Brent Renaud and Ukrainian photojournalist Maxim Levin, both of whom were unarmed at the time they were killed. Furthermore, Russian missile and drone strikes have repeatedly and intentionally damaged the offices of news organizations, including Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and Ukrainska Pravda. This is demonstrating that Moscow considers the media infrastructure to be a legitimate military target. Now, this war on the press is a global phenomenon and extending far beyond major conflict zones. In the first 7 months of 2025 alone, at least 13 journalists were murdered in Latin America, a region whose reporters covering organized crime, drug syndicates, and political corruption face immense danger. The data confirms a trend identified by UNESCO. Journalists are increasingly unsafe, even in countries not officially experiencing armed conflict. They are just being targeted and killed for exposing uncomfortable truths in such nations. Now, let's take a look at the shield of impunity, the failure of international law when it comes to protecting journalists. The escalating violence against journalists is enabled by a near total failure of the international justice system. The crisis is not one of legal ambiguity. It's the laws are there to protect journalists and they are clear and well established. Rather, instead, it is a crisis of political impunity, where state and non state actors violate these laws with the knowledge that there will be no meaningful consequences. International humanitarian law, specifically the 1949 Geneva Conventions and their 1977 additional protocols, explicitly categorizes journalists on dangerous missions in conflict zones as civilians. They must be respected and protected, provided they take no action that would forfeit that status. And what that essentially means is that as long as you are not picking up weapons or getting involved in the conflict in any way. Now, they are intentionally directing attacks against journalists in these regions, and that is a war crime under the Rome Statutes of the International Criminal Court and multiple UN Security Council resolutions that have reaffirmed these protections and condemned the attacks. Despite the robust legal framework now, the gap between law and reality is a chasm globally. An estimated 9 out of 10 cases where a journalist is murdered, the killers go unpunished. This is staggering in terms of the rate of impunity that's been created, and it brings a vicious cycle. The failure to prosecute past crimes emboldens future perpetrators, fostering a climate of fear that chills reporting and, of course, encourages self censorship. This failure is most pronounced among powerful state actors who act with systemic disregard for international norms. Now, let's take a look at the case of Israel. The UN Human Rights Office has repeatedly called for accountability for the killings of journalists in Gaza, noting a pattern where Israeli authorities announce investigations that are rarely, if ever, completed and which result in no justice or accountability whatsoever. Now, in 2023, the CPJ report published before the current war had already concluded that Israel engages in a deadly pattern of lethal force against journalists and failed to hold perpetrators accountable. So, again, that was before this current war started. And that was indicating a long-standing issue of impunity once again. Now, similarly, Russia has deeply entrenched history of impunity for crimes against journalists there and in places such as Ukraine. In the renowned case of investigative reporter Anna I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher that last name, so I won't even try. But in any event, Anna P., who was murdered in 2006 for her reporting on Chechnya, 5 men were eventually convicted for her murder, but the masterminds who actually ordered the assassination have never been brought to justice. Again, it's a failure of the system to follow through or to hold people accountable. Now, this pattern repeats across numerous cases, signaling a clear lack of political will at the highest levels of the Russian government to solve these crimes, particularly when they involve journalists critical of the state. Sounds familiar as we look at Iran. Yes, the state itself is the primary perpetrator. They systematically target journalists at home and abroad. Iranian authorities harass, threaten, intimidate, and basically go after reporters, including those working for the Persian language outlets in the United Kingdom. Now, in a particularly insidious tactic, the state engages in proxy punishment. Yes, they threaten or detain family members still in Iran to coerce journalists abroad into silence. It sounds familiar. We've heard the same thing, or the same accusations about India with their transnational repression. Now, reporters are often tried and convicted in absentia on vague charges of propaganda against the Islamic Republic, and that in itself is just a legal maneuver designed to delegitimize the work and intimidate the colleagues of those reporters that are there. So, as we continue on, the lack of consequences in Iran, of course, is from powerful nations creating, the lack of consequences for Iran and the other nations creates basically a permissive global environment. When a major power like Russia consistently fails to prosecute the architects of a journalist murder, or what a key U.S. ally like Israel is facing widespread condemnation, but again, no concrete sanctions for the unprecedented number of journalist deaths. It's sending a clear message to other regions. This state sponsored impunity is contagious. It signals that the international norms protecting journalists can be violated without significant cost. Thereby, that goes to erode the global standard of protection and making journalists everywhere less safe. That is a true fact, ladies and gentlemen, and I spoke a lot of that in war zones and refugee sites and that with other journalists. And it is a crazy place out there because the respect, or at least the protections that were once afforded to journalists, seem to be less and less now. It seems that because of that impunity, journalists understand that they are at a much greater risk of being kidnapped, tortured, killed, threatened, as just so many different things. Now, the physical violence that is targeting journalists does not occur in a vacuum. It's nurtured and legitimized by a toxic political environment in which leaders around the world use hostile rhetoric to demonize the press. This language is not merely criticism, it's a political tool that frames journalism as illegitimate and hostile act. Thereby, this creates a permissive atmosphere for harassment and violence. Yes, you knew it was coming. In the United States, a central pillar of President Trump's political strategy has been a sustained assault on the free press. He has repeatedly labeled journalists the enemy of the people, a phrase with dark historical echoes, as it's used by totalitarian, sorry, tongue twisters. Anyways, the dictators like Stalin, Hitler, and Mao to justify purges and silent dissent. This is where Trump is at now. Now, this rhetoric intentionally basically recast journalists from their role as democratic watchdogs into that of subversive enemies of the state. This position has been formalized by his administration with a White House statement declaring that asking the president questions is a privilege granted to journalists, not a legal right. Well, there goes democracy. And they also vow to hold the fake news accountable for their lies. And unfortunately, the fake news to Donald Trump and his administration is anybody that asks a question that challenges him, challenges his administration or his policies. It's not that it's an inappropriate question, it's a very appropriate question. However, not one that Trump wants to answer because he knows that he has to plan his lies ahead of time because he's getting caught up in them. He can't keep all of his lies and such straight. But again, through his bullying, harassment, insults, and everything else that's going on, it is intimidating the media and the journalists that are supposed to be impartially reporting on the White House and on the political landscape. With that said, of course, Trump is also using the courts to weaponize the civil side of the court system to sue news agencies, producers, and the networks for millions, if not billions of dollars, with his threats just continuing. And of course, the big part of that is that these different media outlets are caving. They are offering settlements. They are bowing to the whims of a dictator wannabe. And this is because they have a fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders of the corporation. They are still there to make a profit. And that is where another issue lies, is that he's getting rid of the less focused on profit and more of the public domain in terms of independent journalists, in terms of the free press, in terms of PBS, and so many others. So again, he's trying to stack his press corps and the press room with people who are friendly to his agenda and throw softball questions at Bargain Basement Barbie. Now, we've seen this where people ask him or insinuate certain outcomes from certain actions, and Trump or Levitt have gone crazy on the media for that, or started insulting them right in front of other media, calling them hoaxes, calling them fake news outlets, calling them incapable. And it just amazes me and astonishes me that more people have not filed suits against Donald Trump for that, because it not only has an effect in the United States and increases the violent attacks and hatred towards even the most honest and reputable reporters and journalists, but it also shows a pattern that is being followed around the world. Now, the sustained verbal assault has a direct measurable impact. Again, the recent survey by the International Center for Journalists found a disturbing level of public tolerance for the political bullying of the press, particularly among white males, Republican voters as well. Now, more than 1/3 of Americans polled believe it was appropriate for senior politicians to criticize journalists and news organizations. Well, I would agree with that to a point. If they are being unfair or they are being very one-sided or pushing a false agenda, then yes, I think that it is very appropriate to criticize or question journalists and news agencies. However, when the normalization of hostility correlates with a rise in physical violence, that becomes an issue, which we are seeing. The Freedom of the Press recorded a 70% increase in assaults on journalists in the US in 2025 compared to 2023. The connection between a leader's demonization of a group and subsequent violence against the group is a well understood phenomenon. By constantly framing the press as a dangerous and illegitimate enemy, political leaders create a permissive environment where volatile supporters may feel justified in taking matters into their own hands, effectively inciting violence while maintaining plausible deniability. Again, a famous play by Donald Trump as he tries to deny any liability for anything. Now, this anti-press playbook has been adopted by authoritarian and populist leaders globally who see it effective. It sees it as highly effective in delegitimizing critics and consolidating power. Imagine that at the White House. Now, in Russia, for example, Vladimir Putin pays lip service to press freedoms while simultaneously enforcing draconian foreign agent and undesirable organization laws that have effectively crushed all independent media there. He frames any genuine criticism as anti-state activity, mirroring the rhetoric used to justify repression. Iran, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, is explicitly accused the press of being enemy base, used to undermine Islamic and revolutionary principles, as I touched on earlier. This is, again, providing the ideological justification for widespread crackdowns and the jailing of reporters. There are so many reporters in the world that get jailed for just speaking the truth. And again, breaching so many of the international laws and conventions, treaties, and so forth. Now, the constant weaponizing of the term fake news represents a particularly insidious threat. It's a cost-free tactic that again erodes the foundational requirement for a functioning democracy, a shared set of facts for public debate. And that is what they are trying to prevent. Now, it also pollutes the information space. It makes it difficult for citizens to distinguish between credible journalism from actual disinformation. Studies have shown that this distrust is often projected onto reputable news sources and not just the purveyors of falsehoods. And of course, for journalists, this hostile environment has a profound and chilling effect. It encourages self-censorship on on many controversial topics, and drives reporters from the profession, ultimately weakening the very institution designed to hold power accountable and dismantling a key pillar of a diplomatic and democratic society. And it's doing that from within. Now, as we look at a conclusion for wrapping up tonight's show, we are running a few minutes late here, so we'll just basically sum it up that the convergence of geopolitical conflict and the erosion of democratic norms has placed the world at a critical juncture. In Ukraine, the facade of diplomacy is being used as a weapon of the war itself, providing a strategic pause for Russia to amass the means for a potentially catastrophic winter offensive against the nation's energy infrastructure. The international community's failure to recognize and counter the strategy of protraction risks enabling a humanitarian disaster intended to break the will of the Ukrainian people and force a resolution on Moscow's terms. Simultaneously, a global war on journalism is accelerating, marked by record-breaking violence and near total impunity from the battlefields of Gaza and Ukraine to the streets of Latin America. Journalists are being tortured, targeted, and killed for their work. The international legal frameworks designed to protect them have proven toothless in the face of political will to silence the press. The physical violence is fueled by the incendiary rhetoric of political leaders, including those in established democracies who have adopted a playbook of demonizing reporters as enemies of the people and dismissing credible reporting as fake news. Donald Trump again. We will just call it as it is. Now, in closing, folks, on these two fronts, the military conflict of Ukraine and the war on truth, they are deeply interconnected. Both are characterized by a cynical disregard for international law and a strategic use of deception to achieve political ends. The failure to hold perpetrators accountable, whether for missile strikes on civilian infrastructure or for the murder of journalists, creates a permissive environment where such atrocities are not only repeated but normalized. The ultimate casualty in this global conflict is the truth itself, leaving societies vulnerable to manipulation, eroding the foundations of democratic accountability, and making the world a more dangerous and unstable place. So again, reach out to those in power, reach out to your Congress members and anyone else, including the White House, and demand that more protections for journalists, not only in North America, but all around the world, are enforced, and that greater punishment will be enacted. As we wrap up the show this evening, ladies and gentlemen, we have been in contact with the long-lost Ron James. Yes, his book. It is amazing. We are going to be having him on the show in the next few weeks. He, it turns out, was busy preparing for his big special that's going to be coming up in Toronto. We'll be talking to him soon about that, as well as his book, All Over the Map. It's been out for a few years, but if you haven't read it and you want to get some good laughs, but also some good insight into one of Canada's classic and most regarded comedians, by all means, check it out. And again, folks, you've been watching Primetime Live here on Jess FM out of Lethbridge, Alberta. Make sure that you leave your comments below or email us with your suggestions for future guests, future topics, and of course, any of your opinions that you want to share with us on stories we've covered. Thank you for joining us once again. We are Primetime Live on Jess FM and Jess TV. Take care, everyone. We'll see you next week. Stay safe.